September 16th, AD 16. Germanicus Julius Caesar, Rome's golden prince and master tactician, stood with 12,000 legionaries facing 25,000 Germanic warriors led by Arminius, the man who'd annihilated 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg Forest 7 years earlier. By sunset, the Germanic coalition lay shattered across 5 miles of corpse-strewn plains, and Rome had finally avenged its greatest military disaster. Think about those numbers. 12,000 Romans against 25,000 battle-hardened Germans who'd already proven they could destroy Roman armies. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how Germanicus turned Arminius's greatest strength into his fatal weakness. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will shatter everything you thought you knew about Roman warfare. First, the tactical trap Germanicus built that Arminius walked straight into despite seeing it coming. Second, the 40-minute cavalry maneuver that killed 4,000 Germans without losing a single Roman horseman. And third, why Arminius's wife was watching from the forest as her husband's dream of a free Germania died in the mud. But here's what makes this truly insane. How did Germanicus convince his men to follow him into the same forests where Varus's legions had been butchered? What did Arminius see in Germanicus's formation that made him abandon his winning Teutoburg tactics? Why did Germanic chieftains start defecting to Rome in the middle of the battle? And how did 12,000 men kill twice their number while suffering fewer than 2,300 casualties? To understand how Germanicus rewrote the rules of forest warfare, we need to go back to the moment when Germania thought Rome could never return. September, AD 9th, the Teutoburg Forest. 3 Roman legions, 17th, Settered, and Antonid, marched in column through dense German woodland, trusting their guide Arminius, a Germanic prince who'd served Rome for years and held Roman citizenship. Then the trees exploded with ambush. For 3 days, 20,000 Roman soldiers were systematically butchered in forest terrain where their training, equipment, and discipline meant nothing. Commander Publius Quinctilius Varus fell on his sword. The legion's eagles were captured, the ultimate Roman humiliation. When news reached Rome, Emperor Augustus reportedly banged his head against palace walls, screaming, "Varus, give me back my legions." And the man who'd orchestrated Rome's worst military disaster? Arminius became a hero across Germania. The warrior who'd proven Rome could bleed and die in the dark forests beyond the Rhine. Here's what made Teutoburg so catastrophic it traumatized Rome for generations. This wasn't a battle. It was a 3-day execution. Varus's column stretched for 9 miles through narrow forest trails, completely unable to deploy into fighting formations. Roman legionaries trained to fight in open terrain, shoulder to shoulder in disciplined ranks, where their short gladi and large shields dominated. In the Teutoburg's dense woodland, those advantages evaporated. Trees stood so close together that Romans couldn't form their standard sentries. The forest floor was a nightmare of roots, mud, and ravines that made organized movement impossible. And from every direction, front, rear, flanks, Germanic warriors materialized from the undergrowth, hurled spears into packed Roman formations, and vanished before the legionaries could respond. Think about the mathematics of that nightmare. 20,000 Roman soldiers, 3 full-strength legions plus auxiliary units, reduced to approximately 1,200 survivors who managed to escape. That's a 94% casualty rate. 94%. In 3 days of continuous ambush and pursuit, Arminius's warriors killed or captured 1,800 Roman soldiers, murdered their camp followers, seized their baggage train, and captured 3 legionary eagles. sacred standards that represented Rome's honor and had never been lost in battle within living memory. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about why Teutoburg succeeded so completely. Arminius didn't just know Roman tactics. He'd commanded Roman auxiliary troops for years. He understood exactly how legions operated, knew their standard marching procedures, recognized how they'd respond to ambush. When Germanic warriors attacked the column's rear, Varus did exactly what Roman doctrine demanded. He halted the advance and sent cohorts backward to secure the rear. That stretched his column even thinner and created more gaps for Germanic attacks. When Varus tried to build a fortified marching camp on the first night, Germanic warriors attacked during construction, preventing the Romans from completing their defenses. Every Roman response to the crisis made the situation worse because Arminius had designed his ambush to exploit standard Roman procedures. The psychological impact was more devastating than the physical casualties. For 3 centuries, Roman legions had been considered invincible in open combat. Yes, they'd lost battles through bad luck or incompetent commanders. But the fundamental assumption remained. Roman discipline, training, and equipment made legionaries superior to any barbarian warriors. Teutoburg shattered that assumption. Germanic tribesmen, men Rome considered primitive savages, had systematically destroyed 3 professional legions. The captured eagles were displayed in Germanic sacred groves as trophies. Roman armor and weapons were melted down or kept as war prizes. And survivors who managed to escape brought back stories that made every Roman soldier on the Rhine frontier question whether the legions could ever cross into Germania again. Arminius became a legend overnight. Tribes that had spent generations fighting each other suddenly saw him as proof that Germania could resist Rome permanently. His tactics, avoid open battle, use forests and terrain, exploit Roman weaknesses, became the blueprint for Germanic warfare. And 7 years later, when Germanicus arrived on the Rhine with orders to avenge Teutoburg, every German warrior believed they knew exactly how to beat Roman legions. They were about to learn that Rome's greatest strength wasn't its tactics or equipment. It was its ability to learn from catastrophic defeats and come back more dangerous than before. AD 13, Germanicus Julius Caesar, nephew and adopted son of Emperor Tiberius, grandson of Mark Antony, great-nephew of Augustus, received command of 8 legions on the Rhine frontier with one obsessive mission: avenge Teutoburg and reconquer Germania. At 27 years old, he was everything Rome loved. Charismatic, handsome, brilliant, beloved by his soldiers, married to Agrippina the Elder, Augustus's granddaughter, and carrying the weight of Roman pride on his shoulders. But Germanicus wasn't just seeking glory. He'd studied Teutoburg's failure with clinical precision, interviewed survivors, examined Arminius's tactics, and identified exactly why Varus lost. The Germans had exploited Roman weaknesses: rigid formations, heavy equipment, reliance on open field tactics. By fighting in terrain where none of those advantages mattered, Germanicus's solution was revolutionary. Don't fight the Germans in their forests. Make them fight Romans in Roman-chosen terrain. And if they won't come out, burn the forests down until they have no choice. The force Germanicus inherited was staggering in scale but shattered in morale. 8 legions. Legions or Germanica, 2 Augusta, Vuvilaudi, 30 Gemina, 14 Gemina, 17th Gallica, 25th Valeria Victrix, and 28 Rapax, totaling approximately 40,000 legionaries, plus another 40,000 auxiliary troops. That's 80,000 professional soldiers, the largest concentration of Roman military power anywhere in the empire. Think about that number. Augustus had refused to send reinforcements after Teutoburg, declaring Germania not worth the cost. Now his successor Tiberius was committing 1/3 of Rome's entire military to this single frontier. The message was clear. Teutoburg could not stand unavenged, regardless of cost. But those 8 legions were terrified. Many contained survivors from Teutoburg or soldiers who'd helped bury the victims when Germanicus led recovery expeditions into the forest in AD 1415. They'd seen what Germanic ambush tactics could do. They'd walked through the Teutoburg killing ground and found rusted armor still containing bones, skulls nailed to trees, altars where Romans had been sacrificed to Germanic gods. Morale was catastrophic. Legionaries on the Rhine mutinied twice in AD 14 alone, demanding discharge, back pay, and reassignment anywhere except Germania. Some units threatened to march on Rome itself if forced to cross the Rhine again. Here's where Germanicus's genius became apparent. He didn't just command these men, he transformed them. He spent months visiting every legion personally, sleeping in common soldier tents, eating standard rations, listening to their fears. When the Legions 5 and Vustimonsi mutinied in late AD 14, demanding better conditions and refusing to fight in Germania, Germanicus didn't execute the ringleaders. Instead, he stood before 10,000 angry soldiers, drew his sword, and offered it to them. "If you believe I've failed you," he said, "kill me now. But if you still trust Rome, trust that I will never lead you where I wouldn't go myself." The soldiers, shamed and inspired, not only ended the mutiny, but begged him to lead them into Germania immediately. But Germanicus wasn't ready yet. He understood something that Varus never had. You don't beat guerrilla warfare through conventional military operations. You beat it through systematic terror that makes resistance more costly than submission. Throughout AD 14 and 15, Germanicus launched what modern strategists would call punitive expeditions. Lightning raids designed not to hold territory, but to destroy Germanic will to resist. His legions would cross the Rhine in winter when rivers were frozen solid, march 50 miles into Germanic territory in 48 hours, burn entire villages, slaughter livestock, enslave populations, and withdraw before Germanic war bands could concentrate against them. One raid in AD 15 penetrated 200 miles into Germania, destroyed the sacred Tanfana temple, a religious site central to Germanic identity, and killed everyone within 10 miles of it. The casualty figures from these raids were deliberately lopsided and meant to send a message. In one expedition, Germanicus's forces killed approximately 2,000 Germanic warriors and civilians, while losing fewer than 50 legionaries. The mathematics of terror demonstrate that Roman revenge would be so overwhelming, so disproportionate, that resistance became suicide. Germanic villages began evacuating at the mere rumor of Roman columns approaching. Some tribes sent ambassadors to Germanicus, offering submission without fighting. But Arminius and his coalition of hardline tribes refused to submit, and that refusal would lead both armies to Idistaviso. By AD 16, Germanicus had transformed 8 demoralized legions into a force that didn't just want to fight. They were desperate to face Arminius in open battle and prove that Teutoburg had been an aberration, not the new reality of Roman Germanic warfare. They'd trained for 3 years specifically to counter Germanic tactics. They'd burned enough villages to believe Germania could be conquered, and they were about to get their chance to prove it. But Arminius had spent those same 3 years preparing too, and he believed he knew exactly how to destroy another Roman army. AD 14 to 15. Germanicus didn't invade immediately. He spent 2 years conducting what military historians now call total war against Germanic settlements. Systematic raids designed not to conquer, but to terrorize. His legions crossed the Rhine in winter when rivers were frozen, attacked villages with surgical precision, burned crops, slaughtered livestock, enslaved populations and withdrew before Germanic war bands could concentrate against them. The message was clear. Rome had returned, and it was more vicious than before. Germanicus also did something no Roman commander had tried. He sent reconnaissance expeditions into the Teutoburg Forest to find and bury the remains of Varus's legions, recovering bones, rusted weapons, and pieces of armor scattered across miles of woodland. His soldiers wept as they buried comrades who'd been dead for 6 years. The psychological impact was electric. These men weren't just fighting for Rome, they were avenging brothers whose corpses had been left to rot. By AD 16, Germanicus had transformed 8 demoralized frontier legions into a force burning for revenge. The scale of Germanicus's raiding campaign was unprecedented in Roman military history. Between AD 14 and AD 15, his forces conducted no fewer than 12 major expeditions into Germanic territory, each involving between 10,000 and 30,000 troops, each penetrating 50 to 200 miles beyond the Rhine, each designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. One raid in autumn AD 14 struck the Marsi tribe during their autumn festival, catching them drunk and defenseless. Roman legionaries slaughtered approximately 15,000 Marsi, men, women, children, in a single night. Entire villages were burned to ash. Survivors fled into forests and starved during winter. The casualty ratio was obscene: 15,000 Germanic dead, 23 Roman casualties, mostly from accidents during the night attack. Here's what made these operations militarily revolutionary. Germanicus wasn't trying to hold territory. He was systematically destroying Germania's economic infrastructure and cultural identity. Every raid targeted food supplies, burning granaries, slaughtering cattle and pigs, poisoning wells, torching fields just before harvest. The goal was to create famine conditions that would make supporting Arminius's resistance impossible. Germanic war bands needed to eat. If their villages were ash and their crops were burned, warriors would abandon Arminius to protect their own starving families. It was strategic starvation warfare executed with Roman efficiency. But the Teutoburg burial expedition in AD 15 was something different, something darker and more powerful. Germanicus led 6 legions into the forest where Varus had died, following survivor testimonies to locate the massacre sites. What they found was beyond horror. 6 years after the battle, the Teutoburg killing ground remained littered with bones. Skulls were nailed to trees, Germanic ritual sacrifices. Altars built from Roman armor still stood where Germanic priests had butchered captured legionaries. Pieces of armor, rusted weapons, shattered shields lay scattered across the miles of woodland. And everywhere, were bones. Ribs, femurs, skulls with holes smashed through them. The remains of 18,000 Romans who'd been left to rot where they fell. Think about what Germanicus was doing psychologically. He ordered his legionaries to collect every bone, every piece of armor, every weapon fragment they could find. For days, Roman soldiers walked through forests, picking up the remains of comrades they'd never met. Soldiers who died screaming in Germanic ambushes 6 years earlier. They built funeral pyres and burned the bones with full military honors, something Roman religion demanded, but which had been impossible immediately after Teutoburg. Tacitus, the Roman historian, described legionaries weeping openly as they gathered remains, some finding armor pieces marked with names of friends or relatives who'd served under Varus. The psychological transformation was complete. These weren't just soldiers following orders anymore. They were men who'd literally held the bones of butchered comrades in their hands, who'd walked ground soaked with Roman blood, who'd seen with their own eyes what Germanic victory looked like. Every legionary who participated in the Teutoburg burial expedition emerged radicalized, convinced that Germania needed to be crushed so completely that no tribe would ever dare ambush a Roman legion again. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Germanicus's preparation. He was also training his legions specifically to counter Arminius's forest tactics. Standard Roman doctrine emphasized tight formations and open-field battles. Germanicus drilled his men in forest fighting, looser formations that could navigate dense woodland, small unit tactics for pursuing enemies through trees, rapid deployment from marching column to battle line. He equipped entire cohorts with lighter armor for mobility. He recruited Germanic auxiliaries who knew the forests intimately and could track Arminius's warriors through terrain where Romans would get lost. By AD 16, Germanicus commanded legions that could fight in forests if necessary, but preferred to force the Germans into open terrain where Roman advantages, discipline, equipment, coordinated tactics would dominate. And in spring AD 16, Germanicus was finally ready to stop raiding and start conquering. His legions had spent 2 years learning to hate Germania with religious intensity. His logistics were prepared for a campaign lasting months. His strategy was refined to exploit every Germanic weakness Teutoburg had revealed. All he needed now was for Arminius to make one critical mistake: accepting battle on Germanicus's terms instead of his own. And that mistake was coming. Arminius wasn't just a warrior. He was a political genius who'd accomplished what no Germanic leader had managed before: unifying fractious tribes into a genuine military coalition. Born into the Cherusci tribe, taken as a hostage to Rome as a child, trained in Roman military tactics, granted citizenship, and serving as an officer in Roman auxilia forces, Arminius understood exactly how Rome fought and exactly how to kill Romans. After Teutoburg, his reputation made him untouchable. Tribes that had spent centuries fighting each other, Cherusci, Bructeri, Marsi, Chatti, Chauci, swore oaths to follow him. By AD 16, Arminius commanded perhaps 30,000 warriors, maybe more, united by the belief that Rome could be permanently expelled from Germania. But here's what Arminius didn't fully understand. Germanicus wasn't Varus. The young Roman commander had studied Teutoburg obsessively and built his entire strategy around one principle: never fight where Arminius wants you to fight. Think about what Arminius had achieved politically in just 7 years. Germania had no tradition of unified leadership. The tribes were fiercely independent. Cherusci warriors considered Chatti barely better than enemies. Bructeri and Marsi had been raiding each other for generations. Chauci coastal tribes viewed interior forest tribes as backward savages. Blood feuds between families stretched back centuries. The idea of these tribes fighting together under a single commander was historically impossible. Yet Arminius had forged them into a coalition through a combination of charisma, proven military success, and one unifying hatred: Rome. His tactical doctrine after Teutoburg became Germanic military gospel. Never fight Romans in open terrain, where their formations and discipline dominate. Always use forests, marshes, and broken ground where legionaries can't deploy properly. Attack supply lines and foraging parties, not main battle formations. Ambush marching columns where Romans can't maneuver. Pursue defeated enemies relentlessly, but withdraw immediately when Romans form defensive positions. It was guerrilla warfare refined to perfection, and it had already destroyed 3 Roman legions. Every Germanic warrior believed these tactics were invincible because they'd watched them work. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Arminius's strategic position in AD 16. He was actually losing the war, despite winning every tactical engagement. Germanicus's raids had devastated Germanic settlements. The Marsi tribe had been nearly exterminated, 15,000 dead in a single night, their survivors scattered and starving. The Bructeri had lost 3 major villages and couldn't feed their warriors. The Chatti were negotiating secret peace terms with Rome because continuing resistance meant watching their children starve. Arminius's coalition was fracturing under the pressure of Roman total warfare, and he knew it. The mathematics were brutal. Germanicus could lose men and replace them. Rome had unlimited reinforcements, professional training systems, and the wealth to maintain armies indefinitely. Arminius couldn't replace casualties. Every Germanic warrior killed was gone permanently. His 30,000-man coalition represented perhaps 40% of Germania's total military-age male population. Lose 10,000 men, and entire tribes would be unable to defend themselves from rival tribes or Roman retaliation. The population mathematics meant Arminius couldn't afford a major battle unless he was certain of victory. Yet by summer AD 16, Arminius faced an impossible choice. If he avoided battle, Germanicus would continue his systematic destruction of Germanic settlements, and the coalition would dissolve as tribes made separate peace to save themselves. If he fought and lost, the coalition would be destroyed militarily, and Germania would be defenseless. But if he fought and won, if he could destroy Germanicus the way he destroyed Varus, Rome might abandon Germania permanently. The raids would stop, and Germanic independence would be secured for generations. Arminius watched Germanicus's army advance in spring AD 16 with growing calculation. The Roman force was massive, 12,000 legionaries in the main battle formation, supported by thousands of auxiliaries and cavalry. But those numbers meant Germanicus needed enormous supplies, which meant vulnerable supply lines. The Romans were advancing methodically, building fortified camps, creating roads. Classic Roman military doctrine that made them predictable. And despite Germanicus's reputation, he was still operating with the same Roman assumptions that had doomed Varus, that Roman discipline and equipment made legionaries superior to Germanic warriors. Arminius began planning. Not another Teutoburg. Germanicus was too smart to march blindly into forest ambushes. But if the Romans could be lured into terrain that looked favorable to them, but actually contained hidden advantages for Germanic forces. If Arminius could force a battle where sheer numbers and ferocity could overwhelm Roman formations before their discipline stabilized, if he could inflict casualties so severe that Germanicus had to retreat. By late summer AD 16, Arminius had assembled his coalition at the Weser River. 30,000 warriors, the largest Germanic army ever gathered under a single commander. Cherusci, Bructeri, Marsi, Chatti, Chauci, and a dozen smaller tribes, all unified by hatred of Rome and belief in Arminius's tactical genius. They'd beaten Rome before. They would beat Rome again. What Arminius didn't know, couldn't know, was that Germanicus had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this moment. The Roman commander wanted Arminius to gather his army, wanted him to commit to a major battle, wanted him to believe his Teutoburg tactics would work again, because Germanicus had built a trap specifically designed to turn Arminius's greatest strength into his death sentence. And in September AD 16, at a place called Idistaviso, that trap was about to close. Arminius wasn't just a warrior, he was a political genius who'd accomplished what no Germanic leader had managed before, unifying fractious tribes into a genuine military coalition. Born into the Cherusci tribe, taken as a hostage to Rome as a child, trained in Roman military tactics, granted citizenship, and serving as an officer in Roman auxilia forces, Arminius understood exactly how Rome fought and exactly how to kill Romans. After Teutoburg, his reputation made him untouchable. Tribes that had spent centuries fighting each other, Cherusci, Bructeri, Marsi, Chatti, Chauci, swore oaths to follow him. By AD 16, Arminius commanded perhaps 30,000 warriors, maybe more, united by the belief that Rome could be permanently expelled from Germania. But here's what Arminius didn't fully understand. Germanicus wasn't Varus. The young Roman commander had studied Teutoburg obsessively and built his entire strategy around one principle: never fight where Arminius wants you to fight. Think about what Arminius had achieved politically in just 7 years. Germania had no tradition of unified leadership. The tribes were fiercely independent. Cherusci warriors considered Chatti barely better than enemies. Bructeri and Marsi had been raiding each other for generations. Chauci coastal tribes viewed interior forest tribes as backward savages. Blood feuds between families stretched back centuries. The idea of these tribes fighting together under a single commander was historically impossible. Yet Arminius had forged them into a coalition through a combination of charisma, proven military success, and one unifying hatred: Rome. His tactical doctrine after Teutoburg became Germanic military gospel. Never fight Romans in open terrain where their formations and discipline dominate. Always use forests, marshes, and broken ground where legionaries can't deploy properly. Attack supply lines and foraging parties, not main battle formations. Ambush marching columns where Romans can't maneuver. Pursue defeated enemies relentlessly, but withdraw immediately when Romans form defensive positions. It was guerrilla warfare refined to perfection, and it had already destroyed 3 Roman legions. Every Germanic warrior believed these tactics were invincible because they'd watched them work. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Arminius's strategic position in AD 16. He was actually losing the war despite winning every tactical engagement. Germanicus's raids had devastated Germanic settlements. The Marsi tribe had been nearly exterminated, 15,000 dead in a single night, their survivors scattered and starving. The Bructeri had lost 3 major villages and couldn't feed their warriors. The Chatti were negotiating secret peace terms with Rome because continuing resistance meant watching their children starve. Arminius's coalition was fracturing under the pressure of Roman total warfare, and he knew it. The mathematics were brutal. Germanicus could lose men and replace them. Rome had unlimited reinforcements, professional training systems, and the wealth to maintain armies indefinitely. Arminius couldn't replace casualties. Every Germanic warrior killed was gone permanently. His 30,000-man coalition represented perhaps 40% of Germania's total military-age male population. Lose 10,000 men, and entire tribes would be unable to defend themselves from rival tribes, or Roman retaliation. The population mathematics meant Arminius couldn't afford a major battle unless he was certain of victory. Yet by summer AD 16, Arminius faced an impossible choice. If he avoided battle, Germanicus would continue his systematic destruction of Germanic settlements, and the coalition would dissolve as tribes made separate peace to save themselves. If he fought and lost, the coalition would be destroyed militarily, and Germania would be defenseless. But if he fought and won, if he could destroy Germanicus the way he destroyed Varus, Rome might abandon Germania permanently, the raids would stop, and Germanic independence would be secured for generations. Arminius watched Germanicus's army advance in spring AD 16 with growing calculation. The Roman force was massive, 12,000 legionaries in the main battle formation, supported by thousands of auxiliaries and cavalry. But those numbers meant Germanicus needed enormous supplies, which meant vulnerable supply lines. The Romans were advancing methodically, building fortified camps, creating roads, classic Roman military doctrine that made them predictable. And despite Germanicus's reputation, he was still operating with the same Roman assumptions that had doomed Varus, that Roman discipline and equipment made legionaries superior to Germanic warriors. Arminius began planning. Not another Teutoburg. Germanicus was too smart to march blindly into forest ambushes. But if the Romans could be lured into terrain that looked favorable to them, but actually contained hidden advantages for Germanic forces, if Arminius could force a battle where sheer numbers and ferocity could overwhelm Roman formations before their discipline stabilized, if he could inflict casualties so severe that Germanicus had to retreat. By late summer AD 16, Arminius had assembled his coalition at the Weser River. 30,000 warriors, the largest Germanic army ever gathered under a single commander. Cherushi, Bructeri, Marsi, Chatti, Chauci, and a dozen smaller tribes, all unified by hatred of Rome and belief in Arminius's tactical genius. They'd beaten Rome before. They would beat Rome again. What Arminius didn't know, couldn't know, was that Germanicus had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this moment. The Roman commander wanted Arminius to gather his army, wanted him to commit to a major battle, wanted him to believe his Teutoburg tactics would work again. Because Germanicus had built a trap specifically designed to turn Arminius's greatest strength into his death sentence. And in September AD 16, at a place called Idistaviso, that trap was about to close. Late summer AD 16, Germanicus positioned his army near the Weser River at a location called Idistaviso, a massive open plain bordered by forest on one side and the river on the other. The position was deliberate and obvious. Germanicus wanted Arminius to see exactly where he was, wanted him to count Roman numbers, wanted him to believe an attack was possible. But here's what made this position brilliant. The plain was wide enough for Roman formations to deploy fully, giving legionaries space to use their training and discipline. The river at their backs prevented Germanic warriors from encircling them, something Arminius had done to devastating effect at Teutoburg. The nearby forests provided German forces cover to mass for attack, but not deep enough to allow prolonged ambush tactics. Germanicus had created a battlefield where Roman strengths, formation discipline, heavy infantry tactics, coordinated cavalry, would dominate, and Germanic strengths, mobility, forest ambush, swarming tactics would be neutralized. And Arminius, watching from the forest edge with 25,000 warriors, saw the Roman deployment and made his fatal decision: attack anyway. The terrain measurements were precise and calculated. Idistaviso plain stretched approximately 2,000 yards wide and 3,000 yards deep. Enough space for 12,000 legionaries to deploy in their standard triple-line formation with room for cavalry maneuvers on both flanks. Think about what that space meant tactically. At Teutoburg, Varus's legions had been compressed into forest trails maybe 20 yards wide, unable to form proper battle lines, forced to fight as individuals rather than coordinated units. Here, Germanicus had positioned his army where every advantage Roman military doctrine had refined over 400 years could be fully employed. His legionaries could stand shoulder to shoulder in their centuries. His cavalry could screen flanks and pursue broken enemies. His commanders could see the entire battlefield and adjust tactics in real time. But here's where Germanicus's genius became apparent to military historians studying this battle centuries later. He'd positioned the Weser River only 400 yards behind his front lines. That sounds like a tactical mistake, blocking your own retreat route. But it was deliberate brilliance. Germanic warriors under Arminius had perfected the tactic of flowing around enemy flanks like water, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, creating chaos that shattered formation discipline. At Teutoburg, they'd encircled Varus's column completely, attacking front, rear, and flanks until the Romans were fighting in all directions at once. The river at Idistaviso made that impossible. Germanic forces could only attack from one direction, across the open plain, because the river blocked approaches from the rear and partially channeled attacks toward the Roman center. The forest positioning was equally calculated. The tree line stood approximately 800 yards from the Roman front line, close enough that Germanic warriors could mass in concealment before attacking, far enough that they'd have to cross 800 yards of open ground under Roman observation before engaging. Germanicus deployed auxiliary archers and slingers in skirmish positions 200 yards forward of his main line, which meant Germanic warriors would face missile fire for 600 yards before reaching Roman heavy infantry. Think about the mathematics of that approach. A running warrior covers maybe 150 yards per minute at combat speed while carrying weapons and shields. That's 4 minutes of exposure to Roman missiles before even reaching the legionary lines. 4 minutes where every Germanic warrior is a target and Romans are shooting into packed masses of advancing enemies. Germanicus inspects his deployment personally, riding along the front lines on his white stallion, stopping to address individual centuries. His legionaries watch him with something approaching religious devotion. This is the prince who'd buried their comrades from Teutoburg, who'd led them through 3 years of brutal raids, who'd promised them revenge and glory. The soldiers can see across the plain to the forest edge where Germanic warriors are massing. They can hear the war cries drifting across the open ground, that distinctive Germanic roar that had terrified Roman armies for generations. But they're not afraid. They're eager. This is what they've trained for. This is why they've endured 3 years of campaigning in hostile territory. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Germanicus's pre-battle psychology. He deliberately positioned his least experienced legion, Legion Germanica, recruited only 3 years earlier, in the center of his line where they'd face the main Germanic assault. This seems insane until you understand Roman tactical doctrine. The center would receive the hardest initial impact. True, but it was also where Roman reserves could reinforce most quickly. Germanicus wanted his veterans, Legions 5 and XX, on the flanks where they could maneuver and exploit breakthroughs. He was betting that even his greenest legion could hold formation long enough for his tactical plan to work. If Legion I broke and ran, the entire Roman line would collapse. But if they held, if soldiers who'd never faced a major battle could maintain discipline under the most terrifying assault in ancient warfare, it would prove that Roman training had evolved beyond anything Arminius understood. Across the plain, Arminius stands at the forest edge conducting his own inspection. 25,000 warriors spread through the trees behind him. Cherusci, Bructeri, Marci, Chatti, Chauci. The largest Germanic army ever assembled. His chieftains are confident, aggressive, demanding immediate attack. They see 12,000 Romans trapped with their backs to a river. They see 2-to-1 numerical advantage. They remember Teutoburg, remember watching Roman legions disintegrate under Germanic assault. Remember that Rome can be beaten. But Arminius, staring across 800 yards of open ground at the Roman formations, feels something he hasn't experienced since before Teutoburg: doubt. The Romans are too perfectly positioned. Their deployment is too confident. Germanicus is too calm, riding casually along his lines as if this were a training exercise rather than battle preparation. Something feels wrong. This feels like... His war chiefs are shouting now, demanding he give the attack signal. Warriors are hammering weapons against shields, working themselves into battle frenzy. The political pressure is overwhelming. If Arminius refuses to attack, His coalition will fracture from shame and accusations of cowardice. If he attacks and loses, the coalition is destroyed. But if he attacks and wins, if he can break those Roman lines the way he broke Varus, Germania will be free forever. At 6:30 a.m., September 16th, AD 16, Arminius raises his spear and gives the signal. 25,000 Germanic warriors surge from the forest, screaming their war cries, charging across open ground toward 12,000 Romans who stand motionless behind their shields, waiting. The Battle of Idistaviso has begun, and in the next 60 seconds, everything Arminius believed about how to fight Romans will be proven catastrophically wrong. September 15th, AD 16, evening. Arminius gathered his tribal chieftains in the forests overlooking Idistaviso. The debate was fierce. Some leaders urged caution. The Romans were positioned too well. The terrain favored legionary tactics. Attacking across open ground would be suicide. Others argued that not attacking would be worse. If Germanicus continued advancing unopposed, he'd systematically conquer every Germanic settlement between the Rhine and the Elbe. Arminius listened, then made his case. Yes, the terrain favored Rome, but the Germans outnumbered the Romans 2-1. Yes, Roman discipline was legendary, but Germanic warriors had already proven at Teutoburg that Roman discipline could be shattered. The key was speed. Hit the Romans hard and fast before they could fully deploy, overwhelm their front lines through sheer mass, break their formations before legionary training could matter. And once the formations broke, the battle would devolve into individual combat where Germanic size, strength, and ferocity would dominate. The chieftains voted. Attack at dawn. Arminius had just committed 25,000 men to fight the exact battle Germanicus wanted. The war council took place around fires deep enough in the forest that Roman scouts couldn't observe. Approximately 40 tribal leaders attended, each commanding between 200 and 2,000 warriors, each with their own agenda and grudges. Ingiomerus, Arminius's uncle and commander of 3,000 Cherusci warriors, spoke first and most forcefully against attack. "I fought at Teutoburg," he said, his voice carrying to every chieftain gathered. "We won because we fought in forests where Romans couldn't see us coming, couldn't form their lines, couldn't use their discipline. This?" He gestured toward the plain visible through the trees. "This is exactly where Romans want us to fight. Open ground, clear sight lines, room for their formations. We'll be charging across 800 yards while they shoot arrows and throw javelins. By the time we reach their lines, half our warriors will be dead." The counter-argument came from Boiocalus, a Chauci chieftain whose village had been burned by Germanicus's raiders 2 months earlier. "And if we don't attack? We hide in forests while Romans build roads through our homeland. We watch them construct forts on our sacred grounds. My people are refugees because I listen to caution. We have 25,000 warriors. They have 12,000 soldiers. When will we ever have better odds?" His words resonated. Most chieftains commanded warriors who'd been displaced by Roman advance. Their tribes were scattered, their villages burned, their credibility with their own people collapsing with every day they avoided battle. Here's what made this debate genuinely tragic. Both sides were completely correct. Ingiomerus understood the tactical reality. Attacking across open ground against prepared Roman positions violated everything that had worked at Teutoburg. But Boiocalus understood the strategic reality. Not fighting meant watching Germanicus systematically conquer Germania through infrastructure and engineering, rather than battle. The Germanic coalition was trapped between two forms of defeat: military annihilation through bad tactics, or political collapse through strategic paralysis. Arminius let the debate rage for 2 hours, listening to every argument, letting chieftains vent their fears and frustrations. Then, near midnight, he stood and spoke. His voice was quiet, forcing the chieftains to lean in and listen. "You're right," he said to Inguiomerus. "The terrain favors Rome. But terrain is only one factor. Numbers matter, momentum matters, fear matters. And right now, Romans fear us. They remember Teutoburg the same way we do. They remember what happens when Germanic warriors commit to close combat. Yes, we'll take casualties crossing that plain. But once we reach their lines, once we're inside their formation, they become individuals fighting for survival. And we become 25,000 warriors who've trained since childhood to kill in close combat. Think about the psychology Arminius was deploying. He wasn't denying the tactical problems. He was reframing them as opportunities. Roman discipline works when they can maintain distance and formation, he continued. But discipline is a cage. It makes them predictable. They'll stand in their lines because their training says they must. They won't retreat even when they should, because retreat breaks formation. We're going to use their discipline against them. We charge fast, hit hard, and don't stop. Some of us will die crossing that plain. But the survivors who reach their lines will break them through sheer weight and fury. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Arminius's tactical plan. It wasn't actually suicidal. He was betting on one critical assumption, that Roman soldiers, many of whom had never faced a major battle, would panic when 25,000 screaming Germanic warriors crashed into their lines. Panic spreads faster than courage. If the front rank broke, the second rank would see their comrades fleeing and break too. Once the formation collapsed, 12,000 individual Romans would be fighting 25,000 Germanic warriors in melee combat, where size, reach, and individual skill mattered more than training. It was the exact scenario that had destroyed countless Roman armies throughout history. But Arminius's plan had one fatal flaw he couldn't have known about. Germanicus had spent 3 years specifically training his legions to resist exactly this psychological assault. Every soldier in those formations had walked through the Teutoburg killing ground and buried the bones of men who'd panicked. They'd spent 3 years conducting raids where maintaining formation discipline meant survival and breaking ranks meant death. They'd been drilled until formation holding became involuntary reflex rather than conscious decision. Arminius was about to charge an army that had been psychologically fortified against the very terror tactics that had always worked before. The vote was called at 1 a.m. 40 chieftains voting by raising their spears. 32 voted for attack. 8 voted for withdrawal. The majority ruled. The Germanic coalition would attack at dawn, September 16th. Arminius had won the political argument, but committed his army to a tactical disaster. As the chieftains dispersed to brief their warriors, Inguiomerus approached his nephew. "You've just killed us all," he said quietly. Arminius met his eyes. "Perhaps, but if we don't fight, we're already dead. At least this way, we die as warriors." At 6:30 a.m. the next morning, 25,000 Germanic warriors would discover that dying as warriors, heroically, courageously, ferociously, meant absolutely nothing when fighting an enemy who'd learned how to turn courage into a tactical liability. The most lopsided battle in Roman Germanic warfare was 9 hours away, and every Germanic warrior was about to learn that sometimes the brave choice and the suicidal choice are exactly the same thing. September 16th, AD 16th, 5:30 a.m. Roman bugles sounded across Idistaviso as 12,000 legionaries assembled in their centuries, checking equipment, tightening armor straps, testing gladius edges. Germanicus had deployed his force in classic triple-line formation. First line consisted of 4 cohorts from each of 3 legions, approximately 5,000 men forming the battle line. Second line, 3 cohorts held in reserve 30 yards back. Third line, cavalry on both flanks, 2,500 horsemen positioned to screen flanks and exploit breakthroughs. Behind the infantry, Germanicus positioned his auxiliary forces, German auxilia who'd allied with Rome, men who hated Arminius for dragging their tribes into doomed resistance. The legionaries were veterans, many who'd survived the Teutoburg aftermath, all burning for revenge. Across the plain, Germanic warriors emerged from the forests, 25,000 men carrying spears, shields, and generations of hatred for Rome. They had no formation, no organized ranks, just tribal war bands clustered around their chieftains, screaming war cries, hammering weapons against shields. To Roman observers, it looked like chaos. But that chaos had destroyed 3 legions. Germanicus, mounted behind his front line, watched the Germans deploy and smiled. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The precision of Roman deployment was almost inhuman in its mechanical efficiency. Each century, 80 men commanded by a centurion, formed into ranks 10 men wide and 8 deep. Spacing between soldiers was exactly 3 feet, measured by centurions walking the lines with measuring cords. Each legionary carried identical equipment. Lorica segmentata, segmented plate armor, weighing 20 pounds. Gladius, short sword, on the right hip. Pugio, dagger, on the left. 2 pila, heavy javelins, held in the left hand, and a scutum, rectangular shield, covering from shoulder to knee. Total equipment weight per soldier, approximately 60 pounds. But these men had trained carrying this weight until moving in armor became as natural as breathing. They stood in perfect silence, watching Germanic warriors mass across the plain, their faces expressionless behind iron helmets. Here's what made the Roman first line psychologically devastating. Germanicus had positioned Legion Ars Germanica in the center, the newest, least experienced legion, flanked by cohorts from legions Via Lauda and XX Valeria Victrix, both veteran formations that had fought in Germania for decades. The veterans would steady the rookies. More importantly, Germanicus wanted Legion I to prove themselves. He told their commander, Legate Caecina, exactly what was expected. Your men will take the first impact. They will not break. They will not retreat. They will stand until relieved or until every Germanic warrior is dead. Understood? Caecina understood. Legion I's soldiers knew they were being tested. Failure meant shame worse than death. So they stood in the center, gripping their shields, waiting for 25,000 warriors to charge directly at them. The cavalry deployment was equally calculated. Germanicus positioned 200 horsemen on each flank. Not heavy cavalry meant for shock charges, but lighter mounted troops armed with lances and spears, mobile enough to pursue broken enemies and strong enough to punch through exposed flanks. Behind the cavalry, an additional 1,000 mounted archers waited. Auxiliaries recruited from eastern provinces who could fire arrows from horseback with devastating accuracy. Think about that combined arms coordination. Infantry holds the center. Cavalry screens flanks and prepares to exploit breakthroughs. Mounted archers provide mobile firepower. Germanic warriors would face 3 different weapon systems simultaneously, each covering the other's weaknesses. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the psychological state of these Roman soldiers. They were terrified and eager in equal measure. Many were young men in their early 20s who joined the legion specifically to avenge Teutoburg. They'd spent 3 years listening to veterans describe what Germanic ambush looked like. The screams, the chaos, the helplessness of watching comrades butchered in forest terrain where Roman training meant nothing. Now those same young soldiers stood in perfect formation on open ground, about to face the same warriors who destroyed Varus's legions. Some were praying silently to Mars, god of war. Others were gripping their shields so tightly their knuckles turned white. But not one was considering retreat, because Roman military culture had drilled one absolute principle into every recruit. The legion never breaks. Individual soldiers might die, but the formation holds. Across the plain, the Germanic deployment looked completely different, and to Roman eyes, completely insane. 25,000 warriors spread across a front approximately 1,000 yards wide had no defined formations, no organized ranks, just tribal clusters. The Cherusci warriors, Arminius's own tribe, massed in the center, perhaps 8,000 men painted for war, carrying 7-foot spears and shields decorated with tribal symbols. To their left, the Bructeri and Chatti formed war bands totaling maybe 7,000 warriors. To their right, the Chauci and smaller tribes assembled another 10,000 men. They didn't stand in neat rows like Romans. They clustered around their chieftains in loose groups, individuals constantly moving, shouting, working themselves into battle frenzy through rhythmic chanting and weapon banging. Germanic warriors were physically imposing in ways that unnerved Roman soldiers. The average Germanic warrior stood nearly 6 feet tall, 4 to 6 inches taller than Mediterranean legionaries. They had massive shoulders from years of farming, hunting, and combat training. Their spears were longer than Roman pila, some reaching 9 feet, giving them reach advantage in the initial clash. Their shields, while less sophisticated than Roman scuda, were huge circular constructions of wood and leather that could deflect sword strikes. And they fought with a psychological intensity that Roman training struggled to counter. Germanic warriors believed dying in battle guaranteed entry to their warrior afterlife. They didn't fear death. They sought it gloriously. At 6:15 a.m., Arminius rode forward on horseback to address his assembled warriors. Roman observers watching through the dawn light could see him moving along the Germanic lines, could hear his voice carrying across the plain, though they couldn't understand the words. What Arminius said was later recorded by Germanic survivors. Romans think their formations make them invincible. Today we prove that courage beats discipline, speed beats order, fury beats training. When you reach their lines, don't stop. Don't hesitate. Hit them like thunder and don't stop hitting until every Roman is dead or running. This is the day Germania becomes free forever. The warriors roared approval, hammering weapons against shields, creating a sound like continuous thunder rolling across the plain. To Legion, or Germanicus soldiers standing in the center of the Roman line, that sound was the embodiment of nightmare. 25,000 voices screaming for Roman blood. At 6:30 a.m., Germanicus raised his hand. The entire Roman line fell silent. 12,000 men, holding their breath, waiting for the order that would begin the largest battle ever fought between Rome and Germania. Germanicus dropped his hand. Roman trumpets blared, and across 800 yards of open ground, 25,000 Germanic warriors surged forward in a charge that shook the earth itself. The Battle of Idistaviso had begun, and in the next 17 minutes, everything both commanders believed about ancient warfare would be tested by blood, steel, and the mathematics of organized killing. 6:45 a.m. Arminius gave the signal. 25,000 Germanic warriors surged across Idistaviso plain like a human avalanche. Not in organized waves, but in one massive, chaotic rush designed to overwhelm through sheer momentum and terror. The ground shook. The war cries were deafening, a sound Roman chroniclers described as the roar of beasts unleashed. Germanic warriors were huge compared to Mediterranean Romans, many standing 6 feet tall or more, carrying 7-foot spears and shields as big as doors. They'd painted their faces, braided their hair and worked themselves into battle frenzy. This was the same tactic that had worked for centuries against Roman enemies. Hit hard, hit fast, break the enemy's nerve before discipline could organize resistance. At 200 yards, the first Roman pylon volley flew, thousands of heavy javelins arcing over the Germanic front ranks. Men fell screaming, impaled through chest and throat. But the charge didn't slow. At 100 yards, the second pylon volley. More casualties. The Germans kept coming. At 50 yards, Germanic warriors hurled their own spears. Lighter, faster, less devastating than pylon, but numerous enough to force the front rank Romans to raise shields. And then, at 6:47 a.m., 25,000 Germanic warriors crashed into 5,000 Roman legionaries with the force of continental collision. The physics of that impact were catastrophic. Germanic warriors running at full sprint, maybe 12 miles per hour while carrying weapons and shields, hit the Roman front line with approximately 180 pounds of momentum per warrior. The front rank legionaries absorbed that impact behind their scuda, 4-foot rectangular shields designed specifically for this moment. The sound was like thousands of hammers hitting wood simultaneously, a crack that echoed across the plain. Germanic warriors in the first wave slammed into Roman shields, expecting the line to buckle, expecting legionaries to stagger backward, expecting the formation to show cracks where individual warriors could exploit weaknesses. Instead, they hit a wall that didn't move. Here's what made the Roman response so devastating. The legionaries in the front rank weren't trying to hold position individually. Each soldier was braced by the man behind him, who was braced by the man behind him, creating a human wall 3 ranks deep. When Germanic warriors pushed forward with their shields and spears, they weren't fighting one Roman. They were fighting against the collective weight and training of 240 men in each century. Think about that. A Germanic warrior weighing 200 pounds trying to push through a line backed by 19,000 pounds of organized Roman resistance. The mathematics made individual strength irrelevant. But here's where the Germanic charge should have worked. Should have shattered Roman lines the way it had shattered countless armies before. The sheer mass of 25,000 warriors packed into a 1,000-yard front created density that physics said should overwhelm any defensive formation. Warriors in the second and third ranks pushed forward, adding their weight to the assault, creating a human wave that compressed the front ranks into the Roman shields with ever-increasing force. Germanic warriors couldn't retreat, even if they wanted to. The press of bodies behind them was too tight. They were trapped in forward momentum, forced to keep pushing, keep stabbing, keep trying to break through. The casualties in those first 2 minutes were horrific on both sides. Germanic warriors in the front ranks pressed against Roman shields, took gladius thrusts to the stomach, groin, and throat, the standard Roman killing zones. Legionaries stabbed with mechanical precision, thrust low under the shield rim into the abdomen, withdraw, thrust again. No wasted motion, no heroic dueling, just systematic killing perfected through decades of training. Germanic warriors fell screaming, collapsing into the growing pile of bodies between the two armies. But for every German who fell, another stepped forward from the ranks behind, maintaining pressure on the Roman line. Roman casualties were equally severe in those opening minutes. Germanic spears, longer than Roman weapons, punched over the shield wall into legionary faces and necks. The front-rank soldiers of Legion the Rest Germanica, the untested center legion, were taking the worst punishment. Approximately 200 legionaries fell in the first 90 seconds of contact, killed by spear thrusts or crushed by the sheer pressure of bodies pressing against their shields. Centurions in the second rank immediately pushed replacement soldiers forward, maintaining the shield wall's integrity even as dead men were dragged backward out of formation. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about those first critical minutes. The Roman line was bending. Not breaking, but bending. The center of Legion I's formation, taking the heaviest Germanic assault, was being pushed backward approximately 3 feet per minute. The legionaries weren't fleeing. They were giving ground in organized fashion, stepping backward in unison, maintaining formation integrity while yielding space. But Germanicus, watching from his command position 50 yards behind the lines, saw what was happening. If Legion Y continued bending, a salient would form. A bulge in the Roman line where Germanic warriors could pour through and attack the flanks of the formations on either side. Once the line broke in one place, the entire formation would collapse. At 6:49 a.m., just 2 minutes into the assault, Germanicus gave the order that would determine whether his 3 years of preparation had been genius or catastrophic miscalculation. He signaled the second-line cohorts to advance. 3,000 fresh legionaries from Legions 5 and XX moved forward in perfect formation, marching through the gaps between first-line sentries and slammed into the back of Legion I's bending formation. The second line didn't replace the first. They reinforced it, adding their weight and shields to the wavering center. Legion I's soldiers, on the verge of psychological breaking, suddenly felt fresh troops behind them. Heard centurions shouting encouragement, realized they weren't alone. The Roman center stopped bending, the line stabilized, and 25,000 Germanic warriors, who'd been pushing forward with unstoppable momentum, suddenly found themselves trapped in a grinding stalemate where their numerical advantage meant nothing and Roman training meant everything. Arminius, positioned behind his assault force, watches with growing horror as his warriors continue hammering against Roman formations that simply refuse to break. This isn't how it's supposed to work. Germanic charges break enemy formations through shock and terror. But the Romans aren't terrified. They're not even retreating. They're standing in perfect lines, killing with mechanical efficiency, and his warriors are dying in heaps without gaining an inch of ground. At 6:52 a.m., 7 minutes into the battle, Arminius realizes with cold certainty that his charge has failed. The Romans are going to hold, and if they hold long enough for their cavalry to maneuver, his entire army is about to be surrounded and systematically destroyed. He has maybe 3 minutes to adapt his tactics before this battle transforms from a close fight into a massacre. And he has absolutely no idea what to do. The impact was catastrophic. Germanic warriors, running at full speed, slammed into Roman shield walls with enough momentum to knock first-rank soldiers backward. Spears punched through shields. Men screamed. Blood sprayed across packed dirt. But here's what didn't happen. The Roman line didn't break, not even close. Legionaries in the first rank braced behind their scuda. 4-foot rectangular shields designed specifically to absorb impact. When Germans pushed forward, the second rank pushed back, adding their weight to the resistance. The third rank stabbed over their shoulders with gladi, short swords designed for close quarters thrusting. Germanic warriors, expecting the line to crumble under their charge's momentum, instead found themselves trapped in a grinding, methodical slaughter. The Roman formation turned combat into an assembly line of death. First rank blocks with shields. Second rank stabs over their shoulders. Third rank replaces casualties. Rotate, repeat, kill. Germanic size and strength meant nothing when they couldn't swing their long spears in the crush. Their shields, designed for individual combat, couldn't interlock into a defensive wall like Roman scuda. Within 5 minutes, the Germanic front ranks were stalling against Roman formations that simply would not yield. The kill rate was mathematically obscene. Roman centurions had drilled their men to execute one killing thrust every 6 seconds. Simple stabs under the shield rim into exposed groins, stomachs, and thighs. Think about that efficiency. Each century of 80 men, working in 3 rotating ranks, could execute approximately 400 kills per minute if every thrust found a target. With 60 centuries engaged along the front line, 1/4 of an 800 legionaries actively fighting, the Romans were theoretically capable of inflicting 24,000 casualties per hour through pure mechanical killing. The reality wasn't quite that efficient, because not every thrust killed, warriors wore some armor, and combat created chaos that disrupted perfect technique. But even at 30% efficiency, the Romans were killing approximately 120 Germanic warriors per minute while the battle remained in close contact. Here's where the Roman tactical doctrine proved devastatingly superior. The gladius was specifically designed for exactly this kind of crushing melee. The weapon was only 18 to 20 inches long, absurdly short by ancient warfare standards, where most swords measured 30 to 40 inches. But in the compressed hell of shield wall combat, where warriors stood packed shoulder to shoulder with barely 2 feet between men, long weapons became liabilities. Germanic spears required space to thrust effectively. Roman gladi needed only 12 inches of clearance to punch forward into flesh. Every Germanic warrior trapped in the front ranks was fighting with a weapon designed for open combat, while Romans used weapons optimized for exactly this nightmare scenario. The casualty disparity in the first 10 minutes was staggering. Approximately 800 Germanic warriors dead or dying in the packed space between the 2 armies. Roman casualties: roughly 180 legionaries killed, mostly from spear thrusts over the shield wall or from warriors who'd managed to grapple individual soldiers and drag them forward into Germanic lines. That's a 4.4 to 1 kill ratio in Rome's favor. And it was only getting worse as Germanic warriors exhausted themselves pushing against formations that wouldn't yield. But here's what made this slaughter genuinely insane. The Germanic warriors couldn't retreat. The mass of 25,000 men packed into a 1,000-yard front meant the front ranks were physically trapped by their own comrades pressing forward from behind. Warriors who wanted to disengage and fall back couldn't. The human pressure was too intense. They were locked in place, forced to keep fighting, keep dying. While Roman gladi punched through their defenses with mechanical precision. The bodies were piling so high that warriors were literally climbing over dead comrades to reach the Roman lines, which meant they were stumbling, off balance, and easy targets for disciplined legionaries who simply thrust forward into exposed bodies tumbling toward them. The Roman rotation system, the key to their endurance, was functioning perfectly. When a front-rank legionary became exhausted from continuous combat, his centurion would tap his shoulder. That soldier would crouch and slip backward while a fresh fighter from the second rank stepped forward to take his position. The shield wall never wavered, never showed gaps, because the replacement happened in coordinated sequence rather than panicked individual decisions. Germanic warriors, fighting as individuals without rotation systems, were exhausting themselves within minutes. A warrior who'd been fighting continuously for 5 minutes was gasping for breath, arms burning from holding shields and swinging weapons, vision narrowing from adrenaline crash. Roman legionaries were rotating fresh fighters into combat every 3 minutes, maintaining peak efficiency while their enemies deteriorated. At 6:55 a.m., 10 minutes into close combat, something extraordinary happened that shocked both armies. A section of Legion that were in Germanicus' front line, the untested legion that had taken the heaviest initial assault, began advancing. Not retreating, not holding position, advancing. 20 legionaries, led by a centurion named Lucius Caelius, pushed forward in lockstep, their shields interlocked, stabbing in perfect unison, physically driving Germanic warriors backward through sheer coordinated pressure. The Germans in that section, exhausted and demoralized, gave ground. Then another century of Legion I advanced. Then another. The entire Roman center, the formation that should have been the weakest point, was now pushing forward into Germanic lines that had lost all momentum. The assault that was supposed to overwhelm through mass and fury had stalled completely. Germanic warriors, packed too tightly to maneuver, trapped between Roman formations advancing from the front and their own comrades pressing from behind, began to panic. The first whispers of retreat spread through Germanic ranks. Chieftains screamed orders to hold position, but individual warriors were already trying to disengage, trying to create space, trying to escape the methodical killing. Germanicus, watching from his command position, saw the Germanic formation starting to fracture. The critical moment had arrived, the instant when a stalled assault transforms into a rout if pressure is applied correctly. He turned to his cavalry commanders and gave the order they'd been waiting for since dawn. Now, hit their flanks. Break them. 2,500 Roman cavalrymen, fresh and ready, spurred their horses forward. They weren't charging into the Germanic center where the infantry combat was still raging. They were sweeping wide around the flanks, positioning to hit Arminius's army from the sides, and rear where there were no formations, no defensive lines, just exhausted warriors with their backs exposed. Arminius sees the cavalry movement and understands immediately what's about to happen. His warriors are trapped in frontal combat with Romans who won't break. Now cavalry is about to attack from directions his men can't possibly defend. In the next 60 seconds, his assault force will be surrounded, and this battle will transform from a close fight into systematic annihilation. He has one chance to save his army, and it requires doing something no Germanic chieftain has ever attempted: ordering a coordinated retreat from close combat with the enemy. If his warriors can disengage before the cavalry completes its flanking maneuver, they can fall back to the forests and survive. But if the retreat becomes a panicked rout, Roman cavalry will chase down and butcher every warrior trying to flee. At 6:58 a.m., Arminius raises his horn and sounds the recall signal. 3 long blasts that every Germanic warrior has been trained to recognize. The signal means break contact, withdraw to rally points, preserve the army. The question is whether 25,000 exhausted, terrified warriors locked in close combat with an enemy that's been killing them for 15 minutes can execute an organized withdrawal, or whether the retreat will collapse into the chaos that gets armies destroyed. 7:05 a.m., the Germanic center was now fully committed. 25,000 warriors pressed against Roman lines, pushing, stabbing, dying in the crush. That's when Germanicus gave the signal his cavalry commanders had been waiting for. Roman cavalry on both flanks, 2,500 horsemen, suddenly charged not into the Germanic warriors, but around them, sweeping wide and hitting the German rear and flanks from angles Arminius couldn't possibly defend. Germanic warriors, focused entirely on breaking the Roman line in front of them, had no formations, no reserves, no way to pivot and meet cavalry attacks from behind. The horsemen didn't engage in sustained combat. They charged through, lances punching into unprotected backs, then wheeled and charged again. Germanic casualties exploded. Men in the rear ranks, suddenly under attack from behind, tried to turn and fight, which created gaps and chaos in the press against Roman infantry. The warriors in front couldn't retreat because their own comrades behind them were panicking from cavalry attacks. Arminius, positioned with his elite guard in the Germanic center, realized with dawning horror that he'd been outmaneuvered. Germanicus hadn't just positioned his cavalry to protect flanks. He'd positioned them to turn the entire Germanic army into a target with no escape. The cavalry maneuver was executed with precision that military historians would study for centuries. The right flank cavalry, 200 horsemen commanded by Legate Stertinius, swept in a wide arc 300 yards beyond the Germanic left flank, accelerating to full gallop, then turned inward and charged directly into the rear of the Germanic formation. Impact came at 7:07 a.m. Germanic warriors in the rear ranks, facing toward the front where the infantry battle raged, had maybe 3 seconds warning before 1,200 cavalry lances punched into their backs. The carnage was immediate and devastating. Cavalry lances, 9-foot wooden shafts tipped with iron points, were designed specifically to punch through unarmored backs and sides. The momentum of a horse running at 20 miles per hour combined with a trained cavalryman's thrust generated enough force to drive lances completely through human bodies, sometimes impaling 2 men on a single thrust. 7:05 a.m. The Germanic center was now fully committed. 25,000 warriors pressed against Roman lines, pushing, stabbing, dying in the crush. That's when Germanicus gave the signal his cavalry commanders had been waiting for. Roman cavalry on both flanks, 2,500 horsemen, suddenly charged not into the Germanic warriors, but around them, sweeping wide, hitting the German rear and flanks from angles Arminius couldn't possibly defend. Germanic warriors, focused entirely on breaking the Roman line in front of them, had no formations, no reserves, no way to pivot and meet cavalry attacks from behind. The horsemen didn't engage in sustained combat. They charged through, lances punching into unprotected backs, then wheeled and charged again. Germanic casualties exploded. Men in the rear ranks, suddenly under attack from behind, tried to turn and fight, which created gaps and chaos in the press against Roman infantry. Arminius, positioned with his elite guard in the Germanic center, realized with dawning horror that he'd been outmaneuvered. Germanicus hadn't just positioned his cavalry to protect flanks. He'd positioned them to turn the entire Germanic army into a target with no escape. The cavalry maneuver was executed with precision that military historians would study for centuries. The right flank cavalry, 200 horsemen commanded by Legate Stertinius, swept in a wide arc 300 yards beyond the Germanic left flank, then turned inward and charged directly into the rear of the Germanic formation. Impact came at 7:07 a.m. 1,200 cavalrymen charging through packed Germanic ranks in a formation 400 yards wide meant 1 horseman every foot of front. Germanic warriors couldn't dodge, couldn't form defensive positions, couldn't do anything except die as the cavalry wave smashed through them. Roman cavalry doctrine was brutal and specific. Charge through at full speed, kill everyone within lance reach. Don't stop to engage individually. Exit the enemy formation on the far side, regroup, and charge through again from a different angle. The left flank cavalry under Tribune Pedo executed the same maneuver simultaneously from the opposite direction, hitting the Germanic right flank and rear with another 200 horsemen. Now Germanic warriors were being attacked from 3 directions. Roman infantry pressing from the front, cavalry smashing through from the left rear, cavalry hammering from the right rear. The Germanic formation, already exhausted from 20 minutes of grinding infantry combat, began to collapse, not from loss of courage, but from simple impossibility of defense. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about this cavalry assault. The mounted archers made it exponentially worse. Behind the lance-armed cavalry, 1,000 Eastern Auxiliary archers on horseback positioned themselves 150 yards from the Germanic formation and began firing arrows into the packed mass of warriors. These weren't precision shots. They were firing into density. With 25,000 men packed into maybe 600 yards of space, every arrow hit something. Germanic warriors trying to turn and face cavalry attacks were shot in the back by archers they couldn't even see. The psychological impact was devastating. Being attacked from multiple directions by enemies you can't reach or counter creates panic faster than any amount of casualties. The casualty rate in the 12 minutes between 7:05 a.m. and 7:17 a.m. was beyond anything recorded in ancient warfare. Approximately 4,000 Germanic warriors killed or wounded. That's 333 casualties per minute. More than 5 deaths every second, sustained for 12 continuous minutes. Roman cavalry casualties during this same period, approximately 40 horsemen killed. That's a 100-to-1 kill ratio. 100 Germanic dead for every Roman cavalryman lost. At 7:17 a.m., Arminius made the hardest decision of his military career. He sounded the retreat horn, 3 long blasts that echoed across the battlefield. The signal every Germanic warrior had been trained to recognize. Break contact, withdraw to forest, preserve the army. But executing an organized retreat while under attack from 3 directions, while trapped in close combat, while cavalry charged through your formations every few minutes, that was nearly impossible. 7:30 a.m. What had been a battle was now becoming an execution. Roman infantry maintained perfect formation discipline, killing with mechanical efficiency. Every Germanic warrior who fell created more room for Romans to advance. The Germans, courageous and skilled in individual combat, had no tactical answer to Roman coordinated warfare. Germanic warriors, packed too tightly to use their long spears effectively, were being butchered by Roman gladi designed for thrusting in close quarters. The short Roman sword was perfectly engineered for this kind of grinding close combat. 18 inches of steel that didn't need swinging room. Just enough space to stab forward into exposed stomachs, groins, and throats. The ground between the 2 armies had become a charnel house. Bodies were piled 3 and 4 deep in some sections. Roman legionaries were literally standing on corpses to maintain their formation positions, gladi dripping blood, shields covered in gore. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, voided bowels from abdominal wounds, sweat, and fear. But the Romans kept fighting with mechanical precision because their training had conditioned them to function even in hell. Germanic casualties by 7:45 a.m., just 1 hour into the battle, had reached approximately 7,000 dead and another 3,000 wounded so severely they couldn't fight. That's 10,000 casualties out of 25,000 engaged. A 40% casualty rate that would have shattered any other army in ancient warfare. But Germanic warriors were still fighting because their tribal culture emphasized dying in battle over living in shame. Roman casualties. Approximately 800 legionaries killed and another 1,500 wounded. That's 2,300 Roman casualties. A 19% casualty rate approaching the breaking point. Legionarum Germanica had taken 35% casualties. Some sentries were down to 40 effective soldiers from their original 80. At 7:50 a.m., something happened that shouldn't have been militarily possible. Legionarum Germanica, the untested legion that had taken the worst casualties, began advancing faster. The soldiers who'd been on the verge of breaking an hour earlier were now pushing forward with renewed aggression, their shield wall unbroken despite 35% casualties. The psychological impact on Germanic warriors was devastating. They'd thrown everything at the Romans: numbers, courage, physical strength, battle frenzy. They'd inflicted severe casualties, and the Romans were advancing. At 7:55 a.m., the Germanic center broke completely. 10,000 warriors who'd been locked in frontal combat suddenly turned and ran for the forests 800 yards away. They were throwing down shields and spears to run faster, abandoning weapons, because the only thought in their minds was escape. 8:15 a.m. Arminius, watching his coalition being systematically destroyed, made one last attempt to salvage the battle. He gathered his personal guard, approximately 500 elite Cherusci warriors, the best fighters Germania produced, and led a direct assault on Germanicus's position behind the Roman lines. The logic was sound. Kill the Roman commander, shatter Roman coordination, turn organized resistance into chaos. It almost worked. Arminius's guard crashed through Roman auxiliary screens, carved through surprise legionary reserves, and got within 50 yards of Germanicus himself. But Germanicus didn't retreat. He grabbed a shield, drew his gladius, and moved forward to meet Arminius personally. At 8:19 a.m., Tribune Pedo, commanding the left flank cavalry, saw Germanicus's position being overrun. He was 300 yards away, with 400 cavalry. He didn't wait for orders. He screamed, "The general!" and charged. 400 Roman cavalry, lances leveled, thundering across broken ground toward Germanicus's position. 400 lances punched into the backs and flanks of Germanic warriors at 20 miles per hour. The elite guard, men who'd carved through Roman auxiliaries with ease, were destroyed in seconds. Approximately 450 elite Cherusci warriors, the finest fighters Germania possessed, lay dead or dying in a space 60 yards wide. Arminius himself took a cavalry lance through his left shoulder, was unhorsed, and barely escaped through personal desperation and his remaining guard's sacrifice. At 8:22 a.m., Germania's greatest warrior fled the battlefield bleeding and defeated, his army collapsing behind him. 8:45 a.m. The Germanic coalition broke in complete psychological collapse. Warriors who'd been fighting desperately for 2 hours suddenly dropped their weapons and ran for the forests. The Roman legionaries maintained formation, reformed ranks, and waited for orders. Discipline, even in victory. But Germanicus's cavalry had no such restraints. He gave one word: pursue. The pursuit began with 2,500 Roman cavalry splitting into hunting packs. Groups of 50 to 100 horsemen operating independently, chasing down clusters of fleeing Germans, killing methodically. Think about the mathematics of cavalry versus fleeing infantry. A horse at full gallop covers ground at 25 miles per hour. An exhausted Germanic warrior moves at maybe 4 miles per hour. The speed differential means cavalry closes distance at 21 miles per hour, roughly 30 feet per second. A warrior with a 300-yard head start has maybe 30 seconds before a cavalry lance punches through his back. The killing efficiency was obscene. A single cavalryman could kill 5 to 8 men before his lance became too blood-slicked to grip properly. Roman cavalry doctrine for pursuit was brutally simple. Ride down fleeing enemies from behind, lance thrust to the back or neck for instant kills. Maintain momentum. Kill until there's nothing left to kill. Between 8:45 a.m. and 12 p.m., 3 hours and 15 minutes of continuous hunting, Roman cavalry killed approximately 8,000 fleeing Germanic warriors. That's 41 kills per minute, more than 1 death every 2 seconds sustained for over 3 hours. Roman cavalry casualties during the pursuit: 23 horsemen killed. That's a 350 to 1 kill ratio. At 10:30 a.m., approximately 2,000 Germanic warriors attempted to form a defensive position on a low hill. Roman cavalry commander Stertinius chose to surround the hill with cavalry, deploy mounted archers, and shoot the formation to pieces from range. By 11:10 a.m., approximately 1,800 were dead, and the remaining 200 surrendered. By noon, the pursuit ended because the horses were physically incapable of continuing. The surviving Germanic warriors, maybe 5,000 out of the original 25,000, were scattered across 20 miles of forest, completely disorganized. The coalition Arminius had built over 7 years had been shattered in less than 6 hours. Germanicus, surveying the battlefield at 12:30 p.m., sees the scope of what he's accomplished. The field is carpeted with Germanic dead. The victory is total, overwhelming, exactly what Rome needed to erase the memory of Teutoburg. Rome has its vengeance. And the fields of Idistaviso will be remembered as the place where 12,000 legionaries proved that discipline, training, and tactical sophistication could overwhelm superior numbers and fierce courage. Equipment, and tactics were an entire generation ahead of Germanic tribal warfare. The casualties at Idistaviso were so lopsided, they strained credibility. Yet multiple sources, both Roman and Germanic, confirm the broad outlines. Germanic dead, approximately 15,000 killed in battle or during the rout. Another 4,000 wounded who die from infections within days. Total Germanic casualties, over 19,000 out of 25,000 engaged. A 76% casualty rate that effectively destroyed Arminius's coalition as a fighting force. Roman casualties, approximately 1,200 dead, mostly from the initial Germanic charge and Arminius's final desperate assault. Another 2,000 wounded, most of whom would recover. Total Roman casualties, roughly 3,200 out of 12,000 engaged. A 27% casualty rate that, while severe, left Germanicus's legions fully capable of continuing operations. Think about that kill ratio, 6.1 in Rome's favor. The Germanic coalition had been obliterated. But here's what makes these numbers genuinely insane. This wasn't a siege where defenders had walls and fortifications. This wasn't an ambush where one side had complete surprise. This was open field battle where both armies knew exactly where the other was. And the smaller Roman force killed nearly 6 Germans for every Roman lost. The battlefield itself told the story in geography of corpses. Roman burial details counted bodies in specific zones to assess where fighting had been most intense. In the center section, where Legion Ars Germanica had held against the main Germanic assault, bodies were piled 4 and 5 deep across a space roughly 200 yards wide. Approximately 6,000 Germanic warriors had died in that single sector, killed by systematic gladius work from legionaries who'd maintained formation despite being outnumbered 3-1 locally. Roman dead in that same sector, 740 legionaries, most from the initial charge impact. That's an 8-1 kill ratio in the most contested part of the battlefield where Germanic numerical advantage should have been overwhelming. The tribal breakdown of casualties revealed which Germanic groups had fought hardest and suffered worst. The Cherusci, Arminius's own tribe, lost approximately 5,500 warriors out of 8,000 engaged, including the 450 elite guards who died trying to kill Germanicus. That's a 69% casualty rate that effectively destroyed the Cherusci as a military power. The Bructeri lost 3,200 out of 5,000, 64% casualties. The Chatti suffered 2,800 dead out of 4,000 engaged, 70% casualties. The Chauci and smaller tribes combined lost approximately 3,500 out of 6,000. Think about what those numbers meant for Germania's future military capacity. These weren't just casualties. They were the military-age male populations of entire tribes being wiped out in a single afternoon. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Roman casualties. The distribution was wildly uneven across the legions. Legion Germanica, positioned in the center, lost 840 men out of approximately 4,000 engaged. 21% casualties, approaching the breaking point for ancient armies. Legion Violaudi lost 420 men, 10.5% casualties. Legion XX Valeria Victrix lost 380 men, 9.5% casualties. The cavalry lost only 160 horsemen out of 2,500, 6.4% casualties, remarkably low given their aggressive operations. The casualty disparity revealed Roman tactical sophistication. Germanicus had positioned his most vulnerable legion where it would face the hardest fighting, but where he could reinforce it quickly. The wounded presented their own horrifying statistics. Of the 4,000 Germanic wounded, Roman field medics estimated that approximately 3,200 would die from infections within a week, an 80% mortality rate. Of the 2,000 Roman wounded, approximately 1,400 would survive, a 70% survival rate that reflected Rome's superior military medicine. Roman legions traveled with trained medici who understood wound cleaning, amputation techniques, and basic infection prevention. Roman soldiers were 3 times more likely to survive combat wounds than Germanic warriors. In the immediate aftermath, Germanicus's soldiers found something that made the victory bittersweet. Thus Nelda, Arminius's pregnant wife, and their young son, captured among Germanic baggage 3 miles north of the battlefield. She was the daughter of Segestes, a pro-Roman chieftain who'd betrayed Arminius months earlier. She'd been following the army, believing her husband would win, believing Germania's independence was inevitable. Now she was a Roman prisoner, 8 months pregnant, watching her husband's dream die in blood-soaked fields. Germanicus sent her to Rome in chains, not from cruelty but calculation. She'd be paraded through Roman streets during his triumph, visual proof that Rome had conquered its conquerors. The tribal defections began within days. The Bructeri sent ambassadors on September 20th, 4 days after the battle, offering submission and hostages. The Chatti followed on September 23rd. The Chautzi defected on September 25th. Within 2 weeks, 8 tribes that had fought under Arminius had made separate peace with Rome. The coalition that had taken 7 years to build disintegrated in 14 days. Chieftains who'd sworn oaths of loyalty now blamed Arminius for leading them to disaster. Arminius escaped with perhaps 5,000 survivors, fleeing deeper into Germania's forests. He'd live another 5 years, still. Fighting, still resisting. But he'd never again command an army large enough to threaten Rome. Between AD 16 and AD 21, he attempted to rebuild his coalition, but tribal leaders wanted nothing to do with him. Some openly called him a curse who'd brought Roman vengeance upon Germania. His own relatives, his uncle Inguiomerus, who'd argued against fighting at Idistaviso, began plotting against him. In AD 21, 5 years after Idistaviso, Arminius was assassinated, almost certainly by relatives from his own Cherushi tribe. Tacitus recorded the event with grim satisfaction. Arminius was killed not by Roman treachery, but by his own kinsmen. He had fought for Germanic freedom and been destroyed by Germans who feared his ambition more than they feared Rome. He was approximately 37 years old. The man who destroyed 3 Roman legions, who'd unified Germania's tribes against impossible odds. Murdered by his own people because his resistance had become more costly than submission. Germanicus returned to Rome in AD 17 for a triumph that Tacitus described as the grandest since Augustus conquered Egypt. On May 26th, AD 17, Germanicus rode through Rome in a golden chariot pulled by 4 white horses. Crowned with a laurel wreath, his face painted red in ancient tradition. Behind him walked 2,400 Germanic prisoners in chains. The recovered legionary eagles from Varus's destroyed legions were carried on display, each representing Roman honor reclaimed. And walking among the prisoners, heavy with chains and carrying her infant son, Thumelicus, was Thusnelda, symbol of Germania's defeat. Approximately 500,000 Romans, nearly half the city's population, lined the triumph route. They screamed themselves hoarse, threw flowers, chanted Germanicus's name until the sound echoed off marble temples. For 8 years since Teutoburg, Rome had lived with shame. Children had grown up hearing stories of the disaster, of Varus's severed head mocked by barbarians, of Roman bones left rotting in Germanic forests. Now they watched Germanic prisoners paraded as conquered enemies, saw the recovered eagles shining in sunlight, witnessed tangible proof that Rome's military supremacy had been restored. But here's what the celebrating crowds didn't know. Emperor Tiberius had already decided to abandon Germania. The financial mathematics were brutal. Germanicus's 4-year campaign had cost approximately 400 million sesterces, roughly 1/3 of Rome's annual military budget spent on a single frontier. The human cost was equally staggering. 15,000 Roman casualties across all campaigns. The logistical infrastructure required permanent garrisons of at least 40,000 troops to maintain. And all that expense was needed to hold territory that generated virtually no tax revenue and required constant military presence to prevent rebellion. Tiberius calculated return on investment. What did conquering Germania gain Rome? Timber and marginal farmland. Nothing like the wealth of Egypt, Gaul, or Syria. What did it cost? Permanent military commitment of 1/3 of Rome's legions to a frontier requiring endless reinforcement. Germania wasn't worth the cost. In AD 17, just 1 year after Idistaviso, Tiberius recalled Germanicus and reassigned him to govern Rome's eastern provinces. Officially, his talents were needed to manage relations with Parthia. Really, Tiberius saw his nephew's popularity as a political threat. Within 3 years, it was as if the Roman conquest had never happened. The fortified camps Germanicus built were abandoned. The roads were reclaimed by forest. Germanic tribes gradually reoccupied territory Rome had briefly controlled. By AD 20, Roman forces had withdrawn to the Rhine frontier, the exact same defensive line they'd held before Germanicus's campaign began. 4 years of brutal warfare, hundreds of millions in treasure, 15,000 Roman casualties, and 25,000 Germanic dead, all for a strategic outcome that returned to the status quo. Germanicus himself would never return to Germania. In AD 19, while governing Syria, he fell ill with symptoms Roman physicians couldn't explain. Sudden fever, weakness, paranoia. He died on October 10th, AD 19, at age 33. His wife Agrippina publicly accused Tiberius of poisoning him. The Roman public believed he'd been murdered, and their grief was unprecedented. Tiberius spent years trying to suppress Germanicus's memory. Think about the tragic parallel. Germanicus, age 33, possibly murdered by political rivals who feared his popularity. Arminius, age 37, assassinated by relatives who blamed him for Germania's suffering. Both men brilliant commanders who understood warfare was as much psychology and politics as tactics. Both beloved by their soldiers, but destroyed by leaders who saw them as threats. Both dead before age 40, their dreams reduced to footnotes in history. But here's the final irony. Germanicus lost strategically by winning tactically. His overwhelming victory proved Rome could conquer Germania militarily. But that proof convinced Tiberius the conquest wasn't worth the cost. Idistaviso demonstrated that even Rome's most brilliant general, commanding the empire's best legions, using revolutionary tactics, achieving 6-to-1 kill ratios, even with all that, could barely pacify a fraction of Germania's territories. The victory was so costly, so difficult, so dependent on perfect conditions that it proved conquest was impossible at acceptable cost. Arminius's vision, Germania free from Roman rule, survived his death and Rome's military superiority. Not because Germanic warriors were better fighters, not because their tactics were superior, but because Rome decided some conquests cost more than their worth. 350 years later, Germanic tribes would cross the Rhine in force and help bring down the Western Roman Empire. The forests Germanicus couldn't permanently conquer would produce the warriors who destroy Rome itself. Sometimes the battles that seem most decisive prove least important. Idistaviso was Rome's greatest victory in Germania, and the beginning of Rome's acknowledgement that some enemies can't be conquered, only contained. 12,000 Romans defeated 25,000 Germans in 6 hours, and the outcome was, nothing changed. The Rhine remained the frontier. Germania remained free. The warrior who lost at Idistaviso ultimately won the war for independence he'd never lived to see secured. That's the real lesson of Idistaviso. Tactics win battles, logistics wins campaigns. But politics, economics, and strategic calculation win wars. Rome proved it could destroy Germanic armies. Germania proved Rome couldn't afford to do so permanently. And in the end, the side that couldn't win battles won the war by simply refusing to stop existing.